So you may notice that I don't actually have a plant right here in front of me because I wanted to highlight the plant that it all started with, which is my Ficus lyrata. And unfortunately, the way that I have this positioned and the way that I bring plants in frame, I can't actually bring my giant Ficus lyrata in front of me, so you're gonna have to see it on the other screen, and you're gonna have to see it from the bottom of the leaves and not the top of the leaves, because that's just how the camera is set up right now. But I already actually had done a care video on Ficus lyrata. You could search for it, and it had my little chicken in it as well. So that has some sentimental value. However, I do want to talk a little bit more about Ficus lyrata care. And recently my Ficus lyrata had to go under some major changes. So when I had shot when I had filmed the Ficus lyrata film with the care video that I did with little Kippy, it was before my house went under construction, and I actually had to cut my Ficus lyrata back by about 2/3, which is such a shame because it would I called it like my little fig forest, but you could still see it. It is still quite large. It's very tall. I didn't really cut off the tops of it. I had to cut off a lot of the side foliage, only because I had 16 people in here actually doing construction at one time, and you can imagine that it is just maddening. And one of the things that I had mentioned with my Ficus lyrata is that the fig trees don't love to be rubbed up against or bumped up against. They will get brown leaves very, very easily if you actually keep on hitting against them. But let's just talk about fig care in general, because it's one of those plants that if you want an actual tree, a veritable tree for your house, then a Ficus lyrata is usually one of the best options. It's one of the few options, next to maybe like a bird of paradise, or maybe you could get a podocarpus, or maybe you could get a different kind of ficus, like a Ficus elastica. So if you want something that is large and stately, then you could get a Ficus lyrata, but you have to have the right light for it. Now, I've actually found that it could work across a range of light. So I used to have another smaller Ficus lyrata towards my northeast facing window, and it was right up against my northeast facing window. I then put a vertical swing garden there, so I actually had to move that Ficus lyrata and get it out of my house, unfortunately, because the other one, which was my monster one that I initially got about 10 or 11 years ago now, was between my southwest facing windows. Now, if you could give it a little bit more of a screened light, so southwest is fine, but if you could give it a little bit more of a screened light, that's going to be better for your Ficus lyrata, because I will tell you, it will find that light, it will press its little leaf face up against the window, and it'll get too much light, and then its chlorophyll will start to degrade, and it'll get a little bit more of yellowing on the leaves, which is actually what I have. And I can't go up and show you because the cameras are not positioned that way. But if you see some of the leaves that are a little bit closer to the southwest facing window, you will see a little bit of yellowing in the leaves. And it's just that it's gotten so big and I can't really move it anywhere else, but I constantly shift the pot in order to move the leaves over and away from the southwest facing window. So it just gets a little bit more angled light, but away from some of those high intense photons that are coming in through the window. So an eastern exposure, a western exposure with a little bit of shade, or a southern exposure, again with shaded during the full sun part of the day, is going to be perfect for your Ficus lyrata. If you're giving it a northern exposure, then I think that's probably going to be a little bit more of the kiss of death for the plant. It is going to need some more of that sunlight that comes through, so you might have to deal with a little bit more like a grow light if you're going to grow it in those conditions. Now, as far as watering goes, I could give you a little bit more of a guideline, but don't take it as gospel, because you really have to observe your plant yourself. Now, it doesn't not mind getting dried out once in a while, and because I'm giving it kind of an intense light where I am, in the summer months, I could be watering the plant up to 3 times a week. But mind you, I also have a very large planter that it's in. So I would say that it's almost 2 feet across. My planter is about 2 feet across. So that is something that I'm going to be watering more because it has a large planter, whereas if it was in a smaller planter, I'd probably be watering it less because there's less surface area of soil, if you will. Then if it's in the winter months, it's obviously there's a lot less heat in the house, there's a lot less intensity of the light. I'm probably watering it more like once a week to once every week and a half. It does like to be dried out, and again, I'm not watering it that intensely because again, has a larger planter that I have it in, and it takes a little while for that soil to actually dry out, because if you're thoroughly watering it, then you have a lot of that soil matrix in there that has soaked up the water. Some of the things that the plant is susceptible to, and I actually see this a lot on Instagram, is that people get these little red spots on their Ficus lyrata, and sometimes their leaves curl in a kind of a weird manner, or the new leaves form in a strange manner, so they might be a little crooked or curled. That is usually from two things. One, less humidity in your house. You need more humidity in order to be able to do that. And sometimes when you have no humidity, it attracts spider mites. And those little red dots are probably the effect of spider mites. Now, don't go crazy and freak out about it, because my Ficus lyrata, after 10 or 11 years, has had spider mites periodically now and again. And it's just that when a plant is actually growing and you're treating it well, and you're treating it or well enough, and it'll continue to put out growth, it will kind of fight through the spider mites, and provided that you give it a little bit of help too. So I bring in biological and beneficial insects into my home in order to be able to fight things like spider mites or thrips or any of the other insects or mites that could actually affect your plants in a non-beneficial kind of way. So that's one way that I do it. And if you want to know a little bit more about that information, then seek out some of my pest episodes that I've done on Plant One On Me. However, you could test a little bit more of like horticultural or neem oil. If your plant is not big enough and you have a hose and you can somehow spray it, that would be great. I don't have that luxury of being able to do that any longer because my plant is just so big. So you have to kind of trust the process, and if you see spider mites, kind of deal with it as quickly as possible so they don't spread to your other plants. But I will tell you from experience, from having my plant undergo some of the stress, especially when the construction workers were in and having to cut it back, I did notice some spider mites that kind of moved in a little bit afterwards. And I also noticed that my plant kind of pushed through it as well. So, you could always just keep your fingers crossed and then let your fig kind of do its thing, because it is a pretty prolific plant. What else can I say? Oh, well, the plant leaves itself are quite large. So as you can see in the frame over there, it has these kind of large fiddle leaf, and lyrata, I should have said this, lyrata actually means like a lyre. So it's got these really big shaped leaves that can collect a lot of dust. So you could just wash that off with a cloth or a sponge. Luckily for the Ficus lyrata, and we're kind of seeing the bottoms of the leaves here, the breathing pores or the stomata are actually primarily underneath the leaves. So if you have an underside of the leaf facing up, then that might actually get some, dust on it, and you're going to want to clean that off. As far as fertilizing goes, these plants, because they're like large tree style plants, I would say giving it a slow release fertilizer is probably the best option, although I've also given mine liquid fertilizer along with my other plants, largely because I have other plants planted in my Ficus lyrata at any given time. So you can do a slow release fertilizer, maybe it's like a 3-1-2 or something of that nature, and allow it to just kind of go into the soil when you water it. So when you water, then that's when the slow release kind of goes through and it goes over time. So if you wanted to do that kind of on a monthly to bi-monthly basis, then that would be great, but usually only during the growing season. Now, I didn't mention where this plant is initially from or where it's native to, and it's on kind of the west coast of Africa, so you could probably see it through the Ivory Coast in Nigeria. And if you ever Googled them or if you ever saw them in the wild, then you'll see they get to be a very, very large plant. And I would say that mine right now is well over 14, 15 feet, but it kind of looks like an old man because it's just, bent over itself, and it's kind of curling down because I only have 10-foot high ceilings, and so it curls a lot. But the sad thing is that I had to cut it back so it no longer feels like my fig forest, but it's still persisting in a really wonderful way, albeit just a little smaller.